Hello and welcome to this episode of our Retired Overseas podcast. I am Kathleen Petticord. I'm the founder and president of Live and Invest Overseas, and I am joined today by a longtime friend, a longtime colleague, and a longtime retired overseas guy. This guy retired overseas early for him and early for the idea. Lee Harrison retired overseas 25 years ago, más o menos, when he was just about 40. Lee can correct my math.
Just a little, I was almost 50.
You're almost 50. Okay. All right. So
49.
You were young, not 35, but you were still young for retiring. And you did your sums just like the Terhorse, who I spoke with recently, and decided that you and your wife had enough, that you were going to take this big leap and launch this big adventure take off on a very unconventional path. Can you tell us how were you able to come to that conclusion and feel comfortable and confident that you had enough resources to make this work?
Thinking back, pick a point in the past, that was what put me over the edge. Is I thought to myself that what could the worst outcome be? Like if this thing really was just a terrible idea, didn't work, what's the worst thing that's going to happen to us? And the worst thing that's going to happen to us is that I'm going to move back to the United States. I'm going to maybe get my old job or a similar job back. We lived in New York City at the time. And I'll be right back where I was this year, and if that's a worst possible outcome, the best
that's
possible
not so outcome, bad. You had a big adventure in the meantime.
Yeah, and you had an adventure in the meantime, and you thought, hey, at least I tried it. It wasn't for me, and it didn't work. But I could move on to something else. But on the other side of the coin, it was limitless. I mean, I didn't even know how limitless the opportunity was, and the adventure was, and what you could do overseas. I had a pretty short horizon, no experience really at this. So other than as a reader of a magazine, you're one of your readers at the time. So there seemed like way a lot of upside, and the downside was something we could live with.
So if I can ask to dig into some specifics from the financial aspects, because I know that reasons people who are interested in pursuing this idea but don't, who are afraid to, or intimidated to the point where they can't actually take the leap. One is just general fear of the unknown, but the other more practical reason that most people who would like to retire overseas don't ever pull the trigger is financial. It's because they're worried that they just don't have enough money to make it work. So what did you have when you were 50, and that was 25 years ago? What did you have to work with?
Well, the main thing that we were counting on at the time was a pension. We knew that we were eligible for a pension. We were both 49 years old, and we had been with the company maybe 10 years. So it wasn't a big pension. It was $2,800 a month. And the goal for us was to live off that and then keep living on that pension for as long as we possibly could, hopefully until we were really at retirement age, 10 years. And then we had a scheme to where we could take what they call substantially equal periodic payments from our IRAs. So the backup plan was, okay, pension, we have inflation, pension doesn't last as long as I thought, then we're going to start doing SEPPs from our IRAs. As it turned out, we went years and years, and we now, like this year, we're taking money finally out of that 401k that we had way back since the 1970s, right?
Which is remarkable and makes a point that you really can retire overseas to certain places on very limited, modest budgets. So you chose Ecuador to start. And you've told me in the past, you showed up to Cuenca and you were the only foreigner around, the only English speaker you met for some long while. You didn't meet another English speaking person for a long while once you settled into Cuenca, which meant you had to learn Spanish pretty quick. You needed to become fluent enough in Spanish to get around, to manage your life. And you've also, over the years, made comments to me like, you would walk around the city, the central square of Cuenca and those, cobblestone streets, and be in awe of the fact that this was your life. This was your everyday, day-to-day life now.
Exactly. And I like to remind myself of that fact, that that you become immune to the fact that you have this really cool life, and you stop appreciating it like you did at the beginning. But I remember the two of us just walking down through the streets, looking at the surroundings, the 18th, 17th century buildings and all that stuff, and think, oh my God, this is, what are we
Look
doing
at
here?
us. This is really cool. This is really fun. And
Yeah.
so you enjoyed that very outside the box experience in Ecuador for, as you said, 7 years, I think. And then what? What did you do next? And
Well,
why?
we used to have and again, we were trying to conserve money, but one thing that we did was we picked 1 or 2 trips every year of exploring something else in South America that we, had heretofore not been very convenient to get to. And then Julie picked Uruguay on one of her first turns and picking our annual getaway. And so we went to Uruguay, and of course I did some research on properties and things ahead of time, and I saw that right in downtown Montevideo, you could get an apartment with a view of the water for $29,000. And I thought, if there's one, there's more. But this started with just picking it from a guidebook, really. And we went there, and what was a real surprise to me was that Uruguay, I didn't know this, was a first world country, drinkable water throughout the country. It was predominantly an Italian culture rather than a Spanish culture. The main cultural footprint is Italian there. And it was culturally honest. I mean, you didn't get shortchanged, you didn't get cheated on things. It's like you do in some of the third world environments. And we decided probably on the first visit that we really wanted to relocate there. And then we took steps to, sell our house in Cuenca, find a property in Uruguay where we could live, and so forth, and ended up moving there in a way different experience than Ecuador was.
So you bought and sold, as you're reminding me, more than one property in Ecuador. You bought and sold in Uruguay. Then from Uruguay, you went to Brazil, I think.
Yes, we bought a place in Brazil, and again, we're not talking huge amounts of money. I mean, I started with, we had $180,000 that we got for our house in Pennsylvania, right? So this is what we started out with for all the properties that we're talking about here. So we didn't start with this huge investment nest egg for buying properties, but the property in Brazil was only $60,000 that we spent for it. It was 8 meters from the high tide line, so we're directly on the water, and we're on an island it was connected to the coast with a causeway. So it wasn't like a remote tropical island, but an island in Brazil. And so we're talking just a very minimal investment. And look at the huge. I mean, we saw this as a huge lifestyle benefit. I mean, we loved Uruguay, but Brazil was just like, comparing the moon to the Bronx. I mean, it's just a totally different world than anything else in Latin America. So
you sold that for a profit as well, that house.
Yes, yeah.
And then went next to Colombia.
Yes, I guess some of these we own concurrently as we.
Okay, fair enough.
We're able to buy them and sell them. But yeah, the next place we went was Colombia, and we got 2 properties there. One was strictly a rental, and one was one that we lived in part-time.
I do want to come back to that, but I just want to finish your story because it is such an inspirational and just fun story. You have such an extended and unique story to tell at this point of your retired overseas adventures, because you weren't finished in Medellin. I remember at the time you said, this is as good as life gets, I think. We've enjoyed our adventures in all these other places where we've settled. But at this point, we're a bit older and we like our creature comforts a little more. And Medellin is a very comfortable, convenient, pleasant city. So it checks all the boxes for someone at retirement age. But that didn't turn out to be true. You were in Medellin for some years, but then what happened?
One thing that we wanted to do is we had, I think it was around that time that we had a grandchild in the United States already. And then she was already here by then. My daughter became pregnant, and so now we're going to have 2 grandchildren in the United States. With our first grandchild, we were away all but for like birthdays and a couple times a year. So we missed a lot of family time with grandchildren at that time. So we thought, with the second one coming along, it would be nice to have something closer. So we took a trip. Again, this is many years later, but we took a trip to to Mexico. And when we landed in Mexico, we discovered Mazatlan and decided, hey, this would be perfect because it's relatively close to the United States. Residency is easy to get. The currency was stable. It kind of made a lot of sense to go to Mazatlan, and it was a beautiful colonial city environment, which is similar to what we enjoyed in Ecuador. So, and again, it was safe and so forth. So that was our next.
And so I love your story for so many reasons, Lee, and it makes the point. It's such a great case study to illustrate the example that this idea is so infinitely customizable, flexible, and that nothing is a one-way leap. Nothing is forever. So the idea of making the move in the first place, as you said from the start, you were going to Ecuador and you told yourself the worst that'll happen is we hate it and we'll go back home and get jobs again. But so from that point of view, which is nothing is a one-way leap and nothing is forever and nothing is not undoable. Anything you do can be undone. So don't let the fear that it won't work out keep you from trying to, or building up the courage to actually take the leap. And then even once you've started your journey, you can change your course, change your path in real time.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the practicalities. So you've mentioned one, which is residency. So you made the choice that where each place where you were going, you wanted to be able to stay as long as you wanted to be able to stay, which meant establishing legal residency.
Yes, and we did that up front because this was a permanent move. I mean, we had no property in the United States, so this was our home. And if it's going to be our home, we want to, get as formal as we can be. We wanted to, as you say, we don't want to do cross border runs and all that
Right.
stuff for what's our home. So we always apply for residency immediately. So that's the attitude I adopted as time goes on. For diversity's sake, I want as many
Right.
countries as possible that when I show up, they have to take me.
Exactly.
And anytime I can add to that list, and I want to be 100% legal when it comes to residency and banking and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree for sure. And having even more than one residency as you do, as we do, it's a layer of peace of mind. It adds some layer of peace of mind, I think. Another practicality that I know everyone wonders about is healthcare and health insurance. And what has your strategy been for that? Have you had international health insurance since you've been living outside the States?
Yes, I had International Blue Cross and Blue Shield. We both did. And it was a benefit of retirement from the company that we used to work for. Excuse me. But it only lasts up until you're 65, and then they put you on Medicare. So then you've got to manage the whole Medicare thing in a different way. But prior to that, we had health insurance that the company picked up the tab for. So I had no complaints about that.
And now you have Medicare, and you're dividing your time back and forth between the states anyway. So do you count on that as a big part of your healthcare plan at this point?
We count on it, and we have used it. I've had health issues that were kind of high dollar items that I was able to fly up to Mayo Clinic and get done because I have Medicare, and I felt I was getting the most sophisticated treatment that I could find. So it's part of the plan. But that said, we get a lot of care done. We've used emergency rooms. We get a lot of care done locally because coming to the U.S. is not always convenient.
Not always possible, right? So at this point, do you still have an international policy, or do you have a local Mexico policy to complement Medicare?
No, we pay out of pocket in Mexico, and
Okay.
and I realize that's a risk at our age, but yeah, we've been paying out of pocket in Mexico, and then we use Medicare. Anything that you could plan for. I mean, it's 4 hours travel time from Mazatlan to Mayo Clinic.
Right. And I know it sounds a little crazy to most Americans, the idea of paying out of pocket for medical care, not having insurance in Mexico, for example, where you're now living. But there are so many places in the world where healthcare, whatever care you might need to access locally is so affordable that it's not as scary an idea as it might seem. All right, that's a perfect place to wrap this up, Lee. Thank you so much for taking time to have this conversation. I hope at some point I can have you back again and you can update us on your ever evolving plan. I know you are nowhere near the end of your very exciting journey retired overseas. Thank you for joining us today. It has been my pleasure to speak with you again. I will be back next month with the next edition of Retired Overseas. Thank you, and we'll be in touch again soon.
Thanks, Kathy.